Welcome back again this week. This time we're going to talk about public education after the Civil War. The growth of conspiratorial control over public education came as a result of decades of work by the Illuminati minions. In one of our earlier segments, we described how Illuminists started to ingratiate themselves into public education in New York City in 1808 and Harvard by 1823 with the Round Hill School. There are several good books that demonstrate the influence of Illuminist minions into public education that started with Horace Mann. Most of them, however, do not get into the means by which the road was paved for Mann. To give you an idea where Mann was coming from, he accompanied Samuel Greeley Howe on a joint honeymoon to Europe. Howe also traveled in Germany in the company of Albert Brisbane, the communist. And Howe had a knack for showing up at revolutionary insurrections in Europe. Howe was one of the secret six involved in supplying guns to the terrorist John Brown. The full background of Howe's activities is contained in my book. This was the sort of person Mann was intimate with. Now, we're not going to document the Horace Mann or the John Dewey involvement in public education. Our purpose here is to supply you with facts unknown with which to give you a better understanding of just what was going on years before. You will recall from an earlier segment that one of the prime directives to the Illuminati members was to gain control of the schools in their area. In America, they concentrated at first on the colleges, training students to become teachers. These teachers were the first victims of this agenda. Most did not then, nor do they today, know how deficient they are in the knowledge of the principles of liberty, the American system, and the Constitution. This was not done overnight. It was a gradual thing. The teachers became victims in the process, not realizing they were being molded as change agents rather than intellectual educators. Lincoln expressed it well enough when describing the strategy of using education as a tool for change. The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. The American system was influenced by men who studied in the illuminated schools in Germany, especially Prussia. Reverend Charles Brooks, a Unitarian minister, wrote some remarks about education and other factors in Europe. These were placed into a publication which stated, "A maxim amongst them seems to be this: whatever we would have in the state, we must first introduce into the schoolroom. Thus, by providing self-government for every mind, they hope to save the expenses of an armed police, while they render the people industrious, peaceful, and happy." Now, this came out of his books on remarks on Europe relating to education, peace, and labor, and their reference to the United States in 1843. Brooks expresses that the Prussians wanted to control their people through education. There were and are today those who wish to teach the Prussian manner outlined above. Whatever we would first have in the state, we must first introduce into the schoolroom. The fact is that America had few illiterates before we had public schools as we know them. Today, in some parts of the country, as many as 1/3 of those who start school never graduate from high school. And American education is anywhere from 19th to 25th behind the rest of the industrialized world, depending on the subject. This is not the way it used to be in America. Brooks goes on to describe the miserable percentage of illiterates in Europe and the fact that one is hard-pressed to find a person who cannot read or write in America. Even so, Brooks started to install public education based on the Prussian system. Relative to the Land Grant College Act, which gave land scrip to states for educational institutions, we will not get into the fact that the federal government should not have even been granting land they didn't have according to the Constitution. It was supposed to be the property of the states, had the Constitution been followed, when territories were made into states. Much of the scrip went to colleges controlled by members of the order, Skull and Bones. It helped solidify conspiratorial control over education and intellectual pursuits. The legislation, authored by members of the order, were vetoed by Buchanan but signed by Lincoln. There's ample evidence online regarding this act and its use by members of the order. As federal troops marched into the South, a number of changes were made, including the widespread establishment of public education at the state level, but coordinated at first from the federal level through the War Department. These schools were segregated between black and white children. In other words, it was the Northern activists, mostly under communist leadership, who, while professing black equality, initially segregated the schools, not the Southerners. This followed the pattern of public education in much of the North at the time. The National Education Association, or NEA, was started prior to the Civil War. By 1875, William Horry Harris was the president of the NEA. He was a member of the Missouri Hegelians, a founder of the Philosophical Society in St. Louis, became an active member of the Concord School of Philosophy of the Transcendentalists, and in 1880 was the representative of the United States Bureau of Education at the International Congress of Education in Brussels, Belgium. Yes, they started to internationalize American education even then. In Harris, they had the entire package of Illuminist thought. The motto of the Education Association says it all: great public schools for every child. In other words, every child in public schools. They do not like private and homeschooling and have over the decades been advocates of state control over the rights of the parents, particularly in relationship to their children's education. Go to any website of an educational organization or union, and you will find that they are more concerned about Americans fitting into an international system than anything else. Remember, one of the two main axioms of the Illuminati was an international world system of government. This means an international education system that is part of it. It became a losing battle in the schools because there was no contravening organization to oppose the National Education Association. There were local battles here and there against the national powerhouse, fought by moms and dads, but hard to do. What was needed was a national organization, but none were formed. One does not have to venture far to see the results of an education system under the control of the socialists. It is readily apparent in New York City. By the mid-20th century, the educational subversion had become so bad that in New York, the majority of the school teachers there were members of the Socialist Communist-controlled Teachers Union. It is little wonder that the voters of New York elected an open socialist as mayor in 2013 who had worked with communist revolutionaries in Central America. It is rare that sound economics is taught at the college level. By never discussing solid economists such as Hayek, von Mises, Sennholz, etc., the student doesn't even know that something exists other than the socialism of John Maynard Keynes, praised both by fascist dictator Mussolini and American liberals. Computers have made the problem worse by disguising the individual's ignorance. Many people can't function without their droids, iPads, or computers today. There are very many volumes you can read documenting the march toward the control of education of our children by the socialist conspiracy and the part played by Horace Mann. Others have done this well, and there's no need to replicate their work. Some of the best information on this subject has been done by Samuel Blumenfeld with his NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education, Alex Newman, and soon a new book by Dr. Duke Pesta. Our book has much about the influence and takeover of American education by Illuminists. It extended from the beginning of Illuminati membership in America up to today. Much of it is unbelievable, except, stacked up together, it tells quite a story of the subversion of American students' minds over the decades. Next week, we will discuss the build-up for radical changes that occurred after 1900. The stage for it was set much earlier.